if you were going to come up to me and ask me at the start of the PFL regular season, who is going to win the lightweight tournament, I think that I would have a name already in mind, and I think that most people would have agreed across the board.
Yeah, I love it. Congratulations.
I'm, of course, talking about Olivier Aubin-Mercier, who, of course, won it last year. And is looking to make it back-to-back wins in the PFL season. In, of course, the lightweight division, he is fighting in the finals November 24th against Clay Collard, and he is a big favourite, though I don't know the betting odds at the time of recording this and doing all of my research. If you look at the Topology, people can vote for their fight predictions. Aubin-Mercier is currently in 88% to win this fight, according to Topology users, and I know that this is devil's advocate and I will be arguing for the opposite corner, but I think there's a very good reason why Aubin-Mercier is that much of a favourite. His overall skill set, he's of course unbeaten in the PFL. I've said of course a lot of times because these are not opinions, these are facts. OAM is that good.
I guess the PFL got lucky.
I think that if you were going to talk about who the best fighter in the PFL is, you of course... Francis, I'm not counting. We all know, I mean, he's the king of combat sports, but he hasn't fought in the PFL yet. I think Aubin-Mercier will probably be my first round draft pick from the PFL. But standing in his way in the finals, standing in his way of becoming a back-to-back champion in the lightweight division, is the PFL's very own best belt machine, the Kenny Omega of PFL, if you will, Cassius Clay Collard, who I think that has had a bit of a strange road to the finals, which we will get into, that I'm sure you will have already heard about. But if there's anyone that is deserving of being in the finals for the PFL, it is this man, because I would argue that apart from their big name signings, there's probably nobody that has brought this many eyes to the PFL. I mean, when I say big name signings, I'm counting like Kayla Harrison in that as well, because she had hype behind her before even arriving in the PFL. But of course, you know, they've made a lot of big signings and they attract some eyes and stuff. But Clay Collard has been such a great advert for the PFL, because I think that if there was one argument you would make for why the PFL haven't maybe captured people in the way that I think they will in future years, the tournament format, though I think it is crucial to their growth and to becoming a legitimate alternative to the UFC, it means that you get a lot of fights that I think that people know what I mean, right? It's a tournament and there's a lot of money at stake, and so with that in mind, you get some fights that don't really live up. And then you have Clay Collard, who you can always bank on to deliver the best fight of the year in the PFL. He probably has... If you were making a top 5 PFL fights of all time, I would imagine he has at least 3 or 4 of them. And of course, he's a bit of a... not a legend killer, but a bit of a... What's the word? A welcoming committee to these new guys that the PFL sign. I'm talking, of course, about his wins over Anthony Pettis, Jeremy Stevens, and Shane Burgos. Like, the man is just... He is the guy when they cross the shore over to the PFL. He is there on the front line saying, "You ain't coming in here just to get easy wins." And Aubin-Mercier, you can put him in that camp as well for sure. But of course, Clay Collard fought in the UFC as well. But you know, regardless. So let's talk about Clay Collard, because I think that if you're going to argue why Clay Collard can win this fight, despite being such a big underdog, despite me saying that OAM is the clear favourite to win the tournament from the very start of the year, you have to talk about what he does and why he is so effective in this format, especially against these guys that have the higher profile names and things like that. And at the end of the day, he's got that dog in him. They don't call him Cassius Clay Collard for a reason. Well, for no reason, rather. They do call him it for a reason, and it's because his boxing is fantastic. He, of course, has legitimate boxing experience and still does that from time to time whilst being on the PFL roster. But when you have that tournament format and you have the way that they score it and the way that you progress, that is why Clay Collard is so effective, is because you could make him fight once every single month and he would still go toe-to-toe with absolutely everybody and not, you know, grind out wins or anything like that. He would still go to war. That is how he fights and that is what he does. And making the fight with Olivier Aubin-Mercier a fight rather than a competition is how he can win this. And that's not a slight on OAM, because he does get finishes and he is very, very good. But of course, if you were going to immediately looking at this fight and saying, how does Clay Collard win? You go, well, he makes it a scrap, right? Simple. Of course, his semi-final matchup this year was against Shane Burgos, who was not supposed to be in the semi-final tournament, but we don't need to get into that because everybody knows what happened there. And we ended up getting the PFL Fight of the Year out of it, which was a no-brainer. Everyone knew that it was going to be the PFL Fight of the Year. And unlike OAM, who used a lot of his grappling and his size to beat Shane Burgos, Clay Collard used his resilience and his boxing skills. I've always thought that Shane Burgos was a very good boxer, sometimes defensively, takes a shot to land one, and sometimes that works in his fights with Charles Jourdain and Billy Quarantillo, and sometimes you get an Edson Barboza who hits too hard, too accurate, too fast, and it causes him problems. And that is what Clay Collard was able to do, despite having a busted front leg during that fight because of the leg kicks. But Collard's boxing fundamentals are so good that even with one leg, he was able to outbox Shane Burgos and win that fight pretty convincingly. And I thought it was going to be quite close. I think that Burgos probably would have been the favourite going into that as well, based on his experience in the UFC. But either way, his output, his boxing skills are his two biggest attributes. If you were going to say what is Olivier Aubin-Mercier's biggest weaknesses, I would probably say it's his boxing. He's very, very good, very well-rounded. But if there was one thing that maybe we haven't seen a whole lot from him, it is that. So let's talk about OAM for a minute, because he doesn't brawl. We'll get to one of his fights that happened in the UFC that was a great fight, but as to why he doesn't really brawl. But similar to if you've watched the Devil's Advocate video on Patchy Mix versus Sergio Pettis coming up at Bellator 301, I spoke about how Sergio Pettis can win that fight by being the matador. And I don't expect Clay Collard to be, elusive, off of the back foot, things like that. But I do think that he can win this fight by frustrating OAM, by constantly hitting him, by constantly jabbing him, constantly moving, and making it difficult for OAM to start those cycles that once he gets in, it's really hard to break him out of, and he just kind of goes through the motions and beats people position to position, right? His speed, his body work, Clay Collard's body work is fantastic. That's another big advantage for him going into this fight, is the ability to mix it up on the feet. Of course, OAM incorporates kicks a lot more. Of course, incorporates takedowns and grappling a lot more, but that isn't to say that Clay Collard is strictly limited. His boxing is very varied, even if it is just his boxing that a lot of people would point to as his best attribute. Clay Collard has fought grapplers in the PFL. He fought Stevie Ray this year. Stevie Ray, of course, known as a submission grappler, specifically in the PFL, is where he's had his best success with that. And of course, he fought Olivier Aubin-Mercier in the final round, in the finals last year. I thought Clay Collard was very, very good off of his back against Stevie Ray in defending, partly because, again, I think his fundamentals and his patience is why his boxing, one of the reasons why his boxing is so good, along with his accuracy and his speed and his cardio. So that idea of being able to keep composed against OAM, I think, is a huge part of why he would be able to win this fight, because, like I said, Aubin-Mercier in those cycles, it's like he gets people and then he's just a machine. It's like, bang, we're doing this, we're going to position, we're winning this round easy, kind of ticking boxes to some degree. Whereas Clay Collard, I think, has the composure to not get carried away in feeling like the fight's getting away from him, right? To look at OAM's losses, like I said, unbeaten in the PFL, you of course have to go back to his days in the UFC, where a lot of people were like, why has this guy been cut, right? So there's not a ton of lessons you can learn from looking at his UFC losses, right? He lost to Arman Sarukian in his last UFC fight and was cut because of it. Come on. Of course, his loss before Sarukian was to Gilbert Burns, which is crazy. But Burns at the time was at lightweight. Very different version of Gilbert Burns, I think, to what we see now. But either way, there was one thing that I did take from watching those fights that OAM had in the UFC, specifically the Burns one. And Burns was able to beat him despite OAM pushing the pace for a lot of the fight and having quite a lot of success. The biggest difference was Burns' counter-striking. I think Gilbert Burns is a fantastic counter-striker, very underrated at it. That shot he caught Damian Maia with, and the shots that he caught OAM with. And a lot of it was by making OAM come to him. And of course, the obvious point here is that Clay Collard doesn't have the same kind of grappling threat that a Gilbert Burns does. OAM is going to think twice about shooting a double on Gilbert Burns. He might not have that same submission threat, convincing him to not do it as when he faces Clay Collard. But Burns was very good at keeping the fight where he wanted it, which was basically making OAM push the pace so that he could land counter strikes, and the power difference between the two was huge, because OAM landed his fair share of good strikes, but it seemed like every time Gilbert Burns landed a counter, it really set OAM back. And I think that Clay Collard with his boxing skills will be watching fights like that where OAM struggles to close distance with his hands, and he'll be going, that's how I win the fight, because I know I can outbox him. I know that I can be patient throughout the fight. As long as I don't let him clinch me against the cage or shoot a double from way out, if he has to close that distance, that is where Clay Collard wins the fight, is countering, getting out the way. Again, to go back to the Sergio Pettis-Patchy mixed fight, playing the matador, right? I think that it'll be difficult because OAM is so good everywhere. But, as I said at the start, well, near the start of the video, if there is one aspect to his game that has been exploited in the past, admittedly, against Gilbert Burns, who even out of the weight class that he should have been fighting at, he was very, very good at lightweight. And then, of course, a great run at welterweight where he challenged for the title and all that good stuff. So, a very, very good striker and a very heavy-handed striker at that in Gilbert Burns. And Clay Collard might not have that same kind of one-punch power, but he does have accuracy on his side. He also has work rate on his side, because the man, that is how he beats a lot of these guys. You know, the Pettis, the Stevens, the Shane Burgos. It's the combination of accuracy and output, rather than, you know, one punch knockout power, like I said, like Gilbert Burns catching OAM coming in. But he can catch him and repeatedly do it and do what Gilbert Burns was able to do and basically never let him get started. That is how I think he wins this fight. Admittedly, this is one of the most straightforward Devil's Advocate videos we have done so far, and probably will do for a little while, because the simple fact is, you look at Clay Collard and you go, what is he best at? Boxing. How's he going to win this fight? By making it a boxing fight. That's going to be tough to do against a guy like OAM, who is so well-rounded. I am aware of that. But I think I've made a decent enough argument there for where he can potentially win this fight against OAM, despite OAM being so effective in the PFL. There are some other cool matchups on this PFL finals card that we probably could have spoke about for the finals matchups. I think that Sadibou C is the underdog in his fight, and I think that he can definitely win that fight, again, with his counter-striking and his takedown defense. I also think that Renan Ferreira is the underdog in the heavyweight finals, and that would be the shortest Devil's Advocate video of all time, because my point would be that he's really big, which, if you haven't seen him, trust me, he's really big. Anyway, that'll do, I think, for the PFL Finals Devil's Advocate. Thank you for checking out this video. Let me know in the comments what fights that are coming up that you want to see us do Devil's Advocate on. How are you seeing these finals matchups going down? All of that good stuff. Leave a like, and that is where we will leave it. So I'll catch you on the next one, and enjoy the fights.
I'm telling you, we've been working on these guns all season long, dog.